What if I were to tell you that Jesus didn't walk on water? At least not the way that you think he did. Would anybody agree with me? Would you raise your hand and say, yeah, Jesus didn't walk on water? Nobody? Would anybody raise their hand and say, yes, Jesus did walk on water? I know it for sure. Raise my hand. Okay. Interesting. Well, let's see. Let's see if I can convince you that Jesus didn't walk on water. You know, when I was in my early teens, there was kind of a renaissance of magic. Okay, do you remember magic from way back in the day? Maybe not Harry Houdini back in the day, but you remember magic, right? The magic shows. And maybe you went to a carnival or something and you saw somebody doing some magic, and maybe you turned on the TV and you got to see some magic special, or maybe you went to Las Vegas and you got to see grand magic up close. And when it made a resurgence, it wasn't like spells and potions and seances, right? It was just tricks, right? It was beautiful, just good old-fashioned magic tricks. And not only was David Copperfield still around and the Penn and Tellers of the world, but there was a new generation of very, very cool magicians. They were very, very cool. They were so cool that you almost couldn't call them magicians anymore. They were illusionists. They were so fancy and so neat. And two of these new hip magicians were Chris Angel, you've heard that name, and David Blaine. And they've emerged. Haven't heard of any of those people? Goodness gracious. Okay, you got some research to do after this. Well, they're very hip magicians. And Chris Angel had a show. It was on TV, it was on every single week, and he was doing new tricks and new amazing feats. And David Blaine always seemed to have some type of special that was on TV. He was always trying to accomplish some new world record of something, doing these magic tricks. It was hard to ignore the amazing things that were happening, right? And they both had incredible card skills. They were beautiful. The way that they could do the sleight of hand and make the magic happen, right? But what they were really known for were these amazing feats that they accomplished. These, what we would call physical illusions that happened right in front of our eyes, or maybe right in front of us on the TV screen. You might be asking yourself, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, they both seem to have this trick that was called levitating. Does anybody know what levitating is? Yeah, when you hover just a little bit off the ground. And for like 13-year-old me, it was pretty amazing, right? Levitating. And they would do it time and time again. And now, we know that it's impossible, right? Do we agree on that? I definitely knew, even as a 13-year-old, that it was impossible to levitate. And yet, I watched the two of them do it over and over and over and over and over again, and it was amazing. Every single time, it was amazing. And then after a number of years, when they continually do it over and over and over again, that amazing trick, well, it starts to dull a little bit, right? And we live in the age of the internet, so what happens? Pretty quickly, somebody comes along and they say, well, it wasn't magic, because here's how you do it. And there's video after video after video. Here's how the trick is performed. And pretty soon, if you know what happens, and if you know how it happens, the trick isn't so cool anymore, is it? And so why is Jesus' trick, why is it still cool after all these years? We watch videos of people walking on water, maybe putting little tables under the water that you can't see, stepping from table to table. But why is Jesus' trick so cool? Well, here's the text from today. As soon as the meal was finished, he insisted that the disciples get in the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed all of the people. And with the crowd dispersed, he climbed the mountain all alone so that he could be by himself and pray. And he stayed there, all alone, late into the night. And meanwhile, that boat was far, far out at sea. And the wind came up against them, and they were battered by the waves. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them walking on the water. And they were scared to death. And they said, "A ghost!" Cried out in terror. But Jesus was quick to comfort them. "Courage, it's me. Don't be afraid." And Peter, suddenly bold, said, "Master, if it's really you, then call me out on the water." And he said, "Come ahead." And jumping out of the boat, Peter walked on the water to Jesus. But when he looked down at the waves that were churning beneath his feet, well, he lost his nerve. And just in that moment, he started to sink. And he cried, "Master, save me." And Jesus didn't hesitate. He reached down and grabbed his hand, and he said, "Faint heart, what got into you?" And the two of them climbed into the boat, and the wind died down. And the disciples in the boat, having watched this entire thing, well, they worshiped Jesus, saying, "This is it. You are God's Son for sure." Have you heard this story? It's a pretty amazing story, right? Fresh on the heels of feeding 5,000 people, we find Jesus and the disciples. What does Jesus do? Not something typical here. We don't really think about it. But Jesus sends the disciples on. He says, "Get on that boat and go. I've got this." Now there's 5,000 people, and what we don't recognize is 5,000 men. That's not including the women and the children there. So you have thousands of people. And Jesus sends his help on. He says, "Go ahead, I got this." And he's left to disperse these people. Imagine a pastor, the church, 7,000 people, serving communion. And he says, "Ushers, deacons, leaders, go ahead, I got you. I'm going to serve each and every one of these people. I'll handle it." Well, that's not very typical, is it? Not very typical. It's not going to happen. But that's how it goes down. And after he deals with all of these people and sends them on his way, Jesus does what he's become known for. He retreats. He goes up the mountain and he prays to God. And my friends, if you don't hear anything else from this sermon, nothing else, I need you to hear this, okay? After Jesus pours out his cup, spiritually, emotionally, and physically, what does he do? He retreats to pray. Every single time. He retreats to pray. And in that prayer, in that moment, in that time of reflection and restoration, he allows God to replenish him from the inside out. And time again, Jesus' strength is directly tied to his connection and his bond with God. When Jesus pours out his energy, he turns back to God and renews that strength, and he emerges from those moments as powerful and as strong as he's ever been. And so while Jesus is having this moment, this conversation with God, the disciples are fighting for their life. They're out in the water, and the waves are crashing, and they're going at it all night. And in the wee bit of the morning, they see what appears to be a ghost on the water. Now, if you've ever been on the water in the open sea, you might understand that you might see some ghosts, right? It's pretty typical, especially when you're fighting in a storm, you're scared for your life, and you're sleep deprived. You might have thought it was a ghost, but it wasn't a ghost at all, right? It was Jesus. Now, why doesn't the trick get old? Why doesn't it get old? Well, the truth is because it's not a trick. It's not a trick, right? Jesus performed all kinds of miracles, right? Turning water into wine. He did all kinds of performative and showy miracles, right? He did all kind of attention-grabbing things to say, "Hey, look at this." But Jesus walking on water wasn't that. It wasn't that. It happened at 4 o'clock in the morning. Do you know anything special about 4 o'clock in the morning? Anybody? Well, if there's going to be some type of tactical operation, there's a good chance it's going to happen at 4 o'clock in the morning. Why? Because that's the time that the most amount of people are in their deepest level of sleep. Not too many people that are sitting awake at 4 o'clock in the morning. We have one. So why the significance of 4 o'clock in the morning? Most people are asleep. Most people are not awake. He chose 4 a.m. in the morning to walk out on that water through the storm, through the chaos of the moment, and help his disciples. Not when the sun was brightly shining, not when the fishermen were out in their boats, not when the women were in the water washing clothes, but in the middle of the night when almost no one could see him. Why is that? Because it wasn't a trick. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't for attention. It wasn't for glory. It wasn't to let people know that he was God. It was Jesus showing up for his people. Just in the same way that God has always done. Whether it be through a burning bush, whether it be through a Messiah, whether it be through a resurrection, or even in a sea of chaos, God shows up. And in response to that availability, Peter raises his hand and he says, "Can I walk on the water with you? That looks fun. I want to do that with you." And so Jesus says, come ahead. Come on out. The water is nice, right? Come on out. And Peter walks on the water as he's looking at Jesus. And the moment that he loses faith, what happens? He begins to sink. And Jesus saves him. And Jesus reminds us in that moment, each and every one of us, that faith beats fear every single time. And friends, we like magic, don't we? Raise your hand if you don't like magic. Of course you do. It's amazing, right? We really do. We love the mystery and the intrigue of all of it, and we love to wrestle with how did that happen? Why did that happen? But Jesus isn't magic. And Jesus didn't walk on water, at least not the way that we think he did. He showed up for his people, the people that he loved, in whatever way that he could. And that's not magic. That's just determination. That's just dedication. That's just love. And in the midst of that storm, in the midst of the fear, the disciples got to see who Jesus really was. The great I am. The Son of God, for sure. And a revelation that only happens in the storm. A revelation that only happens in the chaos of this life only when we trust God to show up for us. And then we allow God to do so. And my friends, I don't know all of the ways that God has showed up for you in your life, but I'm sure that the list is countless. All of the moments that God has made his way through the chaos of your life and showed up. But I do know that above all, God is calling you out on the water. God is drawing you out into the water that you might show up for each other in majestic and powerful ways. And the truth of the matter is, it's not a trick to walk on the water. It's not magic. It's faith beating fear with every single step. It's love winning the day. And if you're brave enough and courageous enough to answer the call on your life, then I promise you, you'll find glory with every single step. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Thanks be to God.